Career Club LinkedIn Live event with Dr. Andy Garrett. First of all, on behalf of Career Club, we'd like to welcome you. If you're not familiar with us, we're using proven sales methods and tools to help people find careers that matter to them. And you're welcome to follow us on LinkedIn, career.club. You can follow me. I'd encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn. We're publishing content all the time around career-oriented issues, leadership, things like that, and would love to make sure that you've got access to that. This is a live event, so we would welcome you to chime in. Let us know where you might be listening in from. Please do ask questions, or if you have comments as we go. These events are for you, and we want to make sure that if you have any questions or comments, that we try and find the time to address them as we go. While we're at it, I want to make sure that I thank my colleagues, Joey and Heather, who are the magic behind the scenes of making these events happen. So guys, thank you so much. And with that, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Andy Garrett. Andy, welcome.
Hello, welcome. You're supposed to say welcome. I was supposed to say thank you. Really excited to be here.
No, awesome. So where are you calling in from today, Andy? Where are you based?
So I am in Newport Beach, California. That's where I live, got my private practice, and I'm enjoying. A friend of mine says that, he has a thing on gratitude. And he said there's nobody more grateful than the person who takes the first sip of coffee in the morning. So I'm just feeling very grateful with my cup of coffee here.
I think my wife is grateful after I've had my first sip of coffee.
True, see,
great. Now I'm on my way to becoming a human. So today's topic is around layoffs. And, that's really kind of been dominating the news, I would say, for probably the past couple of months. And it's interesting how the job market has shifted really kind of very from hot water to cold water, it feels like. And, companies that were blowing and going not very long ago are all of a sudden, letting go of fairly large amounts of colleagues. And you and I have collaborated together with some of those affected folks, and I think we're going to talk a lot about that. But today's theme is basically around you don't have to lose your mind just because you lost your job. And you're a clinical psychologist, so just folks have a little bit of an idea of your background. Andy, do you mind sharing that with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology. I've been in private practice, or had my own practice for the past 8 years, I think now, but have been in practice working with clients for almost 20 years, and have gotten a chance to, really work with people. My area of specialty is in identity and understanding what really makes someone who they are, the core, the essence, drilling down on what, the biggest priorities people have, their core values, understanding what motivates people, that really reinforces kind of their highest level of motivation, understanding their strengths. So they have strategies and how that they approach daily challenges and adversity. So they feel like they have a clear sense of purpose. They have coherence in how they handle things. So it's interesting on how something like a job layoff, can really rile somebody at the identity level. I think being able to address it through the lens of creating more a secure sense of who you are, having strategies that fit, kind of using your best strengths can be a great way to respond to the uncertainty that happens in a layoff.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk a lot about values, and we're going to talk a lot about uncertainty as we go in our conversation. First of all, hi, Charlie and David. Thanks so much, guys, for dropping in a comment. It's great to have you both on, both friends of both of ours. If for people who are listening, either live or later, you may recognize Andy's name because Andy is our first, if I can say this right, second time guest. You were on a few months ago, Andy, when we were talking about work-life integration. And so clearly some of those same themes will be applying. One of the things that I appreciate so much about your practice is that work-life integration notion, back to layoffs. And I was reading an article someone forwarded to me today from Forbes where it talks about, so much of our identity, self-worth, community is tied up in our jobs. And when we lose that, particularly when losing it comes as a surprise and as a shock, it can be very, very unsettling.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll sort of use this to sort of kick this off. It ends up leading to a lot of uncertainty about who I am as a person, as a contributor, as the breadwinner or bread contributor. at my household. So maybe we could kick it off a little bit, Andy, just around uncertainty.
Yeah. One thing to cover quickly, I think one of the reasons that, we really, I think, started to talk about, ways to collaborate, understanding that, there's going to be a lot of layoffs as we kind of see it's coming down. We wanted to create resources to be able to help people, because I remember in 2008, the last time that we saw significant, depression or recession, I should say. At that point, I was still working part-time a little bit in a psychiatric hospital. We had a certain demographic that we saw there. That was usually people that had severe psychopathology. But we saw this sudden shift in at least a percentage of our demographics, where it was very high-functioning individuals who their business, their job suddenly was crushed by the recession. And their identity was so anchored or attached to their success and to their business that when things weren't working, they had nothing in them, right, to really kind of prop them up or give them a sense of self or worth. And they kept just kind of applying this kind of rigid way of doing things, and they weren't able to pivot. That sometimes there could have been a solution, there could have been an out, but because their identity was so wrapped into their success and their business, it really just completely, it's like the walls caved in on them. And so I know one of the things that I'm really passionate about right now is helping to give resources. Like, how do you create necessary resilience? Help to create, a term that we've talked about, anti-fragility, before, right? Because if you're trying to create it in the midst of, the highest uncertainty, you've already been laid off, it's much more challenging. It's like trying to learn how to ride a bike in the middle of a hurricane. But if you start to understand how to apply some of these tools now, you start to practice them, then it becomes much more organic, right? And it becomes much easier to be able to apply them if indeed you have to deal with something like this type of uncertainty. So
as we talk about like resilience, and you can define anti-fragility, but it's sort of like the expression, the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. The next best time is today. Yep. So, the reality is for people that are being proactive and want to either help a friend or whatever, today is the best day to start, if you haven't already, to start to build resilience, because, life, this is a statement of the obvious, so sorry, but life is filled with uncertainty, and something's going to happen. I've heard people talk about, you're either getting ready to go into something, you're in something, or you're just coming out of something. But it's sort of always in some cycle of uncertainty surrounds us. And so having that resilience, and I think you're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into some values and things like that. Absolutely. But, in your practice, when someone has a sudden loss, and we're speaking very specifically about layoffs today, right, because so often it's a Friday morning, you get called into a conference room, God forbid it's Zoom calls, so it's been happening here for a little while, but you get called into a conference room by your boss, and there's the HR person in there too. And you're like, oh no, I think I know what's getting ready to happen. And it's, Andy, I'm really sorry. Today's going to be a really tough day. The company has had to go through some belt tightening. Unfortunately, you're getting caught up in that. We're really sorry. But I'm going to turn this over now to my HR colleague, who's going to walk you through the next steps of you separating from the company. I mean, like, nobody came to work today thinking that's what was going to happen. In a few minutes, they're going to have, the copier paper box with some papers and some trophies and plaques and whatever, and they're going to be headed home. Can you talk about where you see people kind of coming from in that state?
I mean, as you're describing that, right, it's almost like I'm, remembering a time where that certainly happened to me, and it feels like the wind's taken out of you, right? It can really feel like a gut punch. And I think very quickly your mind starts to get flooded with, as we said, that sense of uncertainty, right? It's just projecting into this unknown. And unfortunately, a lot of times we project into that all the worst case scenarios. We start to imagine, what if I can't find anything? And there's also a lot of questions that our brains are just like meaning-seeking organisms. We want to understand things. And so we start to ask questions like, why did this happen to me? And even sometimes when we're given an answer, right, there's still a tendency to start to poke. A lot of times that the answers for why tend to be very self-destructive. Maybe I wasn't as good as I thought. I mean, it can be filled in with a whole bunch of answers around there that just gets you to start to question the value you had to the company, your skills, your strengths, things like that, things that really do cut to the core identity. And so that uncertainty, we know uncertainty is really the greatest cause of anxiety, stress, right? You ratchet up the degree of uncertainty high enough, and it can really become debilitating. The brain goes into essentially survival mode. You get kind of tunnel vision where it's hard to think of anything else but what you're struggling with. You get the physical sensations that go along with it, and it shuts down your ability to effectively problem solve, right? Your emotions and thinking gets very rigid. And so at that point, I know I talk a lot about thriving, and that's really what my business is about, is helping. But thriving is really not even on the table at that point, right? I mean, it's hard to thrive when you are so flooded with that sense of uncertainty that you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to kind of get through. However, there certainly is a response, and we know like uncertainty can show up in a variety of ways. So even with the job loss, there's the uncertainty of where will my next job come from? There's financial uncertainty. There's, potentially family uncertainty. How's this going to affect my spouse, my kids? So it really isn't just, necessarily isolated to the experience of the job, but it can start to filter. And we know through research that the most debilitating form of uncertainty is what we call self-uncertainty, right? And that's really where it does cut to that core, that sense of like, because you can't escape your own head and yourself. And when that sense of self-uncertainty kicks in, it essentially is kind of this gnawing sense of, questioning your worth, where does your value come from? And we know that it feels so overwhelming that we feel this urge to try and resolve it. If we don't have the answers within us, right, we start looking outside, and there's just a whole host of negative consequences to that experience. So part of, I know what we've tried to do and what I work on is helping to resolve, especially that fundamental level of self-uncertainty. It's amazing when you can create a secure foundation there, how empowering it is to rise above any other type of uncertainty that you might be experiencing.
Yes. Yeah. So I think one of the things that I want to make sure that we're communicating with listeners is that if you're feeling some of the things that Andy is describing, it's normal. You were sharing with me previously that, part of the way that our brains are wired is to look for danger. And so that kind of negative bent is that there's a naturalness to, kind of going negative on things. But just because it's natural and just because it's normal doesn't mean we need to stay in that place. So that's one thing I just wanted to kind of call out, and you can build on that in a second, please. But the other emotion that I was wondering if you could just talk about for a minute, Andy, is anger. Like I've met so many people over the past, decade and a half doing the networking and helping people in transition. I would say that, two of the dominating emotions are fear and confusion.
Yeah.
But the third one, it's shame, I think would be very high in that too. But also is anger. And what I call metastasized anger is bitterness.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to hold on to this. This is mine, And could you just talk a little bit about people that are dealing with anger as part of all this?
Yeah, there's a part of our brain that essentially processes injustice, something that feels unfair, right? And that tends to be, we get very strong visceral reactions to that. It can create feelings of disgust, of envy, of anger, bitterness. The thing is, this is a primitive part of the brain. And so it reacts very instinctively, and it responds very quickly. And there is an aspect of it that does feel, I don't know if intoxicating might be too strong a word, right? But there's a certain power behind it. And there's even a sense of moral righteousness, right? So people can get really stuck there because it can, feel empowering. It's not particularly healthy, but certainly understandable. The tough part is like the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that ideally you want to get to, that starts to, kind of help with decision making, helps you to strategically think through things. It's where your values exist and all that. But the primitive brain and the prefrontal cortex, right, are essentially at odds with each other in this experience. And the primitive brain is much faster thinking, right? There's a phenomenal book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, by Daniel Kahneman, right? And he really covers that this fast acting brain is impulsive. It wants immediate gratification. And often it gets in the way. We don't always do a great job. This is something, I've got a 6-year-old son that I'm constantly working on, slow down. And as I'm telling him this, I'm like, reminding myself like, oh yeah, this is probably a great lesson for me too. The ability to just slow down, to allow our prefrontal cortex, allow our brain to really think through and not just react to the emotion. I think one of the biggest challenges in dealing with some of these strong emotions is they can create kind of a vicious cycle, right? You start to feel angry, And then that kicks in maybe a thought or a belief that's negative about yourself, which just intensifies the anger, and it creates this really, snowball effect that kind of takes over. The next thing you know, it's kind of consumed you. You might have spent an entire day or an entire weekend just completely, stuck in the subjective nature of that feeling. And so the ability to acknowledge the feeling early on, but to have what we call like emotional agility, right? The ability to have coping skills and tools that allow you to pivot out of that and to create kind of a whole new sequence. Ideally we call it like a virtuous cycle, where you start to reinforce or affirm who you are. You start to move towards your values, and all of a sudden that feels affirming and empowering. But let me acknowledge, as I'm saying this, it's a really tough thing to do, right? And the desire to just want to respond out of those emotions, right? Like, and have the immediate gratification of that is very appealing.
Well, and that's exactly right. And when we're talking about identity and losing identity, sometimes on the anger bit, if I feel like I have been wronged, and there's, as you say, sort of this moral justification, it actually does accomplish some things. Like, it puts me on the moral high ground, which feels like power. It minimizes shame because it wasn't me, it was them, right? And so there are some things that feel good about that. And as I've lost one identity, it allows me to adopt a new identity. If I'm the guy that got screwed, if you knew how badly I got, mistreated and how unfair it was, let me tell you. And I hear this a lot in networking, where, Jim, tell me about yourself. Well, I was there, and I was there for 17 years and blah, 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 blah. And then the new boss came in, and I wasn't his guy or her gal, and how terrible it all was. And even if it's all true, I'll even grant you that everything you just said is true. As to your earlier point, it is not helpful. And it's a very impractical thing to hold on to. So I know that it's easy to talk about conceptually, hey, you need to let that go. But, and maybe we can use this as the way to pivot into, the next section of our conversation on benefit seeking. But just letting go of that is so powerful, but hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think you captured that perfectly, right? That is the juxtaposition there. And right, I think all due compassion to someone that's gone through something like that, right? Certainly understand all the feelings that come out of that. And but you're right, part of the moving or transitioning into, there's an exercise known as a benefit finding exercise. Not necessarily the best name for it, but that's what it's been called. The first time I ever heard of this exercise was how it was used with veterans who had experienced trauma, and they're trying to figure out how to help these veterans to not just go into the kind of PTSD response. And so, one of the things that they really had them trying to do was focus on inner locus of control. What is it that they have the ability?
Say that word again, inner locus?
Inner locus of control.
Okay.
It's a sense of, what do you have the ability to actually take action on, that you have some healthy sense of control over, as opposed to, oftentimes we get preoccupied with all things we have zero control over. What happened to us, the circumstances, what other people's actions were. Right. And when that consumes us, we just start to feel powerless. We feel helpless and powerless. And that really can be the precursor to depression, to anger and bitterness, to a whole series of psychological outcomes that really can be devastating, right? So the more we can really focus back in, it lights up the motivation center of the brain when it feels like it actually has a pathway to take action on. And then, again, it feels almost, I don't know what the right word is, like non-compassionate to say, well, just focus on the bright side of things when someone's gone through something terrible like that. So again, I want to make sure there really is a lot of compassion baked into this and understanding. But at some point is being able to say, is there some way in which you could choose to grow through this? Is there some way, instead of just having to survive, that you can actually become stronger, right? That maybe you can even find a job that's more rewarding, that work-life integration. Maybe you create this really wonderful, opportunity to have a job that reinforces that sense of healthy, holistic identity, right? Where all of a sudden your personal life and your job and all things, they all come together as part of an overall tapestry, right? That's very intentional. So the more that they can focus, so, a lot of these veterans started to focus on how they could become more courageous, right? Having compassion for others who've gone through difficult times. And so it gave them a channel to transform their struggles into something meaningful, and it gave them a purpose. And all of a sudden, it created a whole new phenomena that they called post-traumatic growth. right? So these veterans were now thriving as opposed to going through the PTSD experience. And so it's a really wonderful exercise, right? And really a big part of it is that inner locus of control. How do you keep coming back to them?
I'm sorry, how to keep coming back to what?
The inner locus of control. I mean, that really is so essential to resilience, to better psychological outcomes in this, and to be able to pivot into, being able to feel empowered. Just real brief, I remember the last job before I got into private practice, I was let go at a pain management clinic that just was really struggling. And we had just bought a house, my wife and I. And so I was like, oh, this is not great timing. And so, there was some certainly initial sense of really, being angry and bitter about it because of some promises that were made that didn't get fulfilled. But I recognized there's a hunger here. I need to tap into that, and I need to have that be used as fuel, right? To just every day go out there. So I was fortunate that, I was able to find an opportunity pretty quickly, but I kept focusing on what can I control? What can I take actions on? And from day to day, there was times where the old tapes, right? Old thoughts would try to hijack me, but I just had to keep coming back to, well, I can make 3 more phone calls today, right? I can do a little bit more. And that's what helped me to stay motivated to eventually find an opportunity. But as soon as I get stuck in that, focusing on things I have no control over, it's amazing how that just really shuts down our thinking, our resilience, and everything.
You've taught me a lot about the word and the concept of agency. Do you mind sharing that with folks who are listening?
Yeah, but I think oftentimes agency is I think connected to that sense of autonomy. So I'll frame it in that sense. Autonomy is there's a huge study that looked at the best predictors of long-term sustainable happiness. People who weren't just had fleeting moments of happiness, but people who were consistently happy. And so they wanted to know, what internal characteristics, is it optimism, is it gratitude, is it hopefulness? And they were surprised to find that autonomy was by far the best predictor of happiness. The best definition I've ever seen of autonomy, surprisingly, came from the Merriam Online Dictionary, but it's a self-governed choice or decision with moral agency, right? So it's that sense of, I believe that I can take action on this. It's something that originates from me. And there's a sense of motivation, right, to want to kind of move forward with it. And so it really, I think with autonomy, it does require both sides of that, right? Self-governed choice, it's a choice I'm freely choosing. It's important to me, right? And it's consistent with kind of my higher sense. I know a lot of people that say that independence, freedom, autonomy is their most important value, but the way they exercise it is, you can't tell me what to do, right? It's very reactionary. It's very and I think one of my greatest examples, I think there's some people who appreciate a reference to Viktor Frankl, but he's to me the best example of autonomy. He was in 5 different Nazi concentration camps, right? His mom was killed, his dad was killed, his wife was killed, he was tortured, starved, and yet he was able to find, in the midst of the worst possible circumstances, environment, he was able to find a sense of agency. He found autonomy, happiness, purpose, and meaning, because he realized, he was a psychiatrist, that he could still serve others. He could find a higher good, even as he was being triggered every day, right, with just horrible treatment. He was able to find a way to serve others, right, and to use his unique skill sets in ways that felt very meaningful. And that gives you a freedom, right, when you're able to find that in any circumstances, that is almost unlimited. It is incredibly liberating. And I think a very important thing to find in situations like this. Well, let me ready to reinforce. Tough to do.
No. I mean, you had me at Viktor Frankl. That's how we originally connected. Yeah. I heard you speaking somewhere else, and I'm like, if he's doing Viktor Frankl. So for anybody who doesn't know Viktor Frankl, the book is Man's Search for Meaning, and it's extremely compelling. That's the best way I can say it. So thinking about it, let's kind of keep this in the context of a layoff. So I've lost my job, acknowledging that there's a lot of uncertainty here. And I need to kind of work through some things, and it's genuinely uncertain. I mean, nobody's got a crystal ball. I don't know right this minute, where my next job is going to be. I don't know how much my savings I'm going to have to burn up. Maybe I got a 3-month severance or, some severance, and like that's as much financial runway as I have. So I think we can all agree that the uncertainty is real.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So as you take on a client and we move into the benefit finding area of this, how do you walk people through, or can you think of an example of a client that you've worked with, obviously, completely anonymized, but, an example of like how somebody kind of moved from just being stuck in uncertainty, and then how a benefit finding exercise helped create a path through some of that uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a great question. So much of this is really, again, just around the narrative the meaning that you're applying to what happened. And so there's someone that I worked with who initially their mindset was, just going to get through this. And it was very much a survival instinct. I'm going to grind and kind of grit my way through this. But as going through this exercise, their narrative changed, and the meaning they assigned to it is that I want to grow through this. Now, again, sometimes you have to keep coming back to reinforce that narrative. It'd be awesome if you just did exercise once and it forever transformed your internal narrative into a very empowering. That's usually not the case. I've done this exercise numerous times myself, and oftentimes I have to go through it multiple times to really internalize, that kind of the narrative. It's much more empowering. But it was amazing the transition, right? Or the transformation, I should say, that took place, and just that slight getting through it to growing through it, right? And how one was very empowering, and one helped this person to be able to access strengths and resources that the getting through it certainly didn't inspire.
Yeah, we haven't really, I don't think we've talked about this before, but you sparked this idea of kind of like, one is energy sapping and one is energy giving.
Yep.
And I don't mean that in the crystal's sense of energy and stuff, but like if I'm just trying to grit through something, like, okay, like, come on, one more step, you can do this, like, don't quit. Okay, that's fine and good and necessary. I'm a huge believer in persistence and, don't quit. But on the other hand, when you are energized by something and like, hey, I'm going to be better for this, and there's some good I want to go chase this thing down and see if I can go grab a hold of something that's going to be good for me. There's a lot more energy associated with that than, come on, Bob, you can take one more step. You got it, buddy. Here we go.
Yeah, so true. I mean, think from a sense of autonomy. I mean, who wants to get through things, right? That sense of choice. That's not exactly a choice that is, sounds inspiring, but to grow through something, that certainly sounds much more appealing. And again, we know the way the motivation center of the brain works is that tends to light that motive. It feels like a challenge, right? It feels like a meaningful, worthwhile challenge to pursue. And so that tends to, you're using your brain anatomy or physiology in your favor that way, as opposed to, having to work through all this internal resistance that you'll have when you're just trying to get through something.
So maybe this is a good time to bring up your 50-cent word of anti-fragile, right? Because that is moving past treading water, gritting your teeth, just trying to hang on, and maybe moving into from survival to thriving.
Yeah.
Do you mind explaining the concept of anti-fragility for listeners?
Yeah, it's kind of a paradigm shift, right? From this idea of resilience, which is certainly, I think, a great concept about getting through things. It's more than surviving, but it's kind of like being able to get through and eventually coming out the other end, finding grit, finding strength through your adversity. Anti-fragility is really more about that difficult moments. Adversity actually makes you stronger, right? And so you're experiencing through the lens of, hey, this is difficult, but I'm going to tap into resources and it's only going to strengthen me, right? I'm going to find a sense of purpose. I'm going to build more, whatever character strengths this might, pull out of me. And the truth is, right, many of the people I know who are the most successful individuals that I've ever worked with, their story really is one of anti-fragility, right? It's they experienced a lot of adversity, whether it was in childhood or early in their career. As a byproduct of that, they created guiding principles, the mindset, right, and character strengths that became the foundation of their success. And so it's amazing when you can start to internalize that mindset and recognize that, yes, maybe I didn't choose to go through this, but I can choose to get stronger. I can choose to grow through this, and how empowering that can be.
Well, one of the things that, this is going to be the non-clinical way of saying something, but that we'll talk a lot with clients about is every day, every moment of every day, you have two choices, always, how my attitude and my actions.
Yeah.
Well, that covers a lot of geography. That covers a lot of geography. But on the attitude piece, and maybe we can kind of move into values from here. On the attitude piece, again, I do not want to give short shrift to like really under a heavy load, and I might feel that I'm too old, too young. I don't know enough about this. I know too much about something nobody cares about anymore. Like whatever it is. But as you think about, you know, attitude and maybe using this as a growing stronger opportunity, I'm going to come out of this a better, healthier, stronger person. One of the things that I have seen you do with clients that I think is amazing, and I'll use your word from earlier, transformational, is one of the benefits of losing your job is it presses the pause button. And all the busyness of conference calls and commuting and whatever it is that your job entails gets put on pause. And all of a sudden, you've got time to do some thinking about things that you really haven't taken the time or even thought to take the time to do. And I know a big part of that then becomes, well, what is important to me? Have I been happy the last X years? Have I actually been fighting myself and just thinking, well, that's what everybody does, so just deal with it? And yet when they go through exercises that help them really sort of distill what their values are, it is transformational. I was wondering if you could start to talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, well, I love everything that you're saying, and I agree that when you're going through, a transition and the pause button is hit, I think one of the things that's been really amazing about working with you in this program, one of the worst things that you can do is spend too much time in a state of, not taking any action. Being left in your own thoughts when you're going through uncertainty can often be a very detrimental thing to do. And so, I know through your program, they're given all kinds of exercises that are really healthy. I've heard that over and over again from the clients that we've worked with, right? That it's given them something to focus on that feels productive. And so instead of their time being used lamenting on, kind of the circumstances, they feel like they're taking action that's going to set them up to be successful. So that's huge, right? To be able to do that. When you go through a lot of uncertainty, one of the best responses or antidotes to that is to start to find really good information and great resources that help you to kind of find your way through the uncertainty and to have hope and feel like there's a direction that you're moving towards. So I'll use that as a pivot. I think we talked about this briefly the other day, but the three biggest kind of mistakes that I see people make in their journey to be successful and happy, and I use the metaphor of rowing a boat, and this will get to values, but the first one is that there's not a clear sense of direction that they're heading in, or that sometimes their life is compartmentalized, right? That they may be heading in one direction with their work, but their family life or their physical health or their spiritual life, whatever it might be, right, is totally is going in a different direction, right? There's not a sense of feeling an intentional, like I know exactly where my life is heading and everything's going in the same kind of pathway. And if you've ever rown a boat, you've got one arm kind of rowing in one direction and the other arm going opposite, has you spinning around in circles. So you feel like you're putting a ton of effort, but you just feel like you're not really getting anywhere. That feels really dissatisfying and unfulfilling. And I think when you really define your core values and you do with specificity, I've known a lot of people like, oh, I know my core values. And then I'll ask, it's great, what are they? And they have a very generic sense of what they are, right? There's a sense of, I kind of know what they are, but I've never actually written them down. Man, there's just incredible power in taking the time to actually get very specific with the words, right? We had someone recently who they thought efficiency was their core value, right? And going through it, they realized it was effectiveness. But if efficiency was like, if I'm being efficient in the wrong things, right, that's no good. But yet they had been operating through the kind of prism that everything needs to be efficient, and making that slight transition into being more specific with what actually was a value of theirs was massively transformational, right? And you're really anchoring yourself to the things that have the greatest significance and meaning for you. I know when I feel aligned with my values, I feel like my life is moving forward in that direction. I mean, I feel strong, I feel capable, I feel motivated, I feel purpose-driven. But I call it existential ADD, and it's like constantly all day long, right? I have things pulling at me that are taking me out of my values, whether it's getting onto social media and seeing someone going on yet another vacation. Now I'm questioning, whether I'm going on enough vacations. whether it's the news, right? Some of the stuff that's happening in the world, I have no control over, and I'm worried about that. And it's amazing the difference, right? All of a sudden, my mindset, my emotions, I feel more fragmented. I feel disoriented. So the ability to keep coming back to those values and have them be what's driving you and pushing you forward through this is incredible. So,
so real quick, David's asked a question here. I just wanted to kind of jump in for half of a second. So talking about the change that takes place in one's social network when you're terminated or lose your job. Just David, from what I've seen, and there's actually, I want to say there's an article in the Wall Street Journal or something I was reading here just in the past couple of days. People are becoming much more transparent about it. And we've actually got a client who I thought did a wonderful job of using social media, LinkedIn in this case, to talk about, and this is a benefit finding kind of thing, they were taking some time to do some reading that they haven't done in a long time. They're reading an Adam Grant book. And they put in there, hey, while I'm, in pursuit of my next great career opportunity, I've been taking the time to catch up on some reading I've been meaning to do. One of the books I've been reading is Adam Grant's, whichever one it was. And, a couple of things that really stood out to me were X and Y. And I'm finding those very helpful, as I evaluate where I want to go next. He got like 4,000 impressions. And this is somebody who never posts on LinkedIn. And all of a sudden, people in his network started coming out of the woodwork, like, John, didn't know that you were leaving. Hey, would love to reconnect with you. Hey, we're actually might have something that'd be a fit for you. And it turned out to be a very positive thing for him. What I do think is not cool is, and this gets very much into what we were talking about earlier, is when people are venting online. And they're complaining. And again, it kind of feels good to throw a rock at the old company and the old situation. And I'll show those guys, but it's highly ineffective. So, where people are being vulnerable, transparent about their situation, but casting it in a hopeful light, I'm just watching their social network run to them to want to help.
That's so great. I'll throw in that. I think it's helpful just, using, I think, some of the values and some of the clients that we've worked with together. I think it does a great job of helping to direct to where that social network, right? So even as you're looking for what job I want to take on next, when you're clear with your values, I think it helps your decision-making process, right? So that you're filtering through. A lot of times, some of the unhappiness that you might have experienced in the previous job was often because there was an incompatibility with values, right? There was a sense of not feeling aligned. And that's always going to create conflict. It's always going to create, some inner stress when you feel misaligned there. And so, knowing where do you find these social networks? Where is the place where you're most likely to find people aren't necessarily like-minded, but they care about the same things, right? There's a sense of feeling very aligned, and just the fit. You're going to thrive in an environment where you feel that there is a good fit. So, I think that's really important as you're looking to expand that social network.
Well, and I think we can layer Hunter's comment in here. Talking about approach versus avoidance. And when you can, what he's saying is, when you can get into approach mode, everything changes in your experience and your results, which is true. So again, kind of weaving three things together: values, David's question about social network, and Hunter, you're talking about approach versus avoidance. I know for a fact that in networking, sometimes people are afraid to engage their network. I was on the phone with a client last week on this exact topic because of the shame that they were feeling. And they had a low self-esteem and like, well, I'm sure Andy's really busy. I don't want to bug him. By the way, this is incredibly embarrassing. And so what most people, I think, know that your best avenue for your next role is going to come through your network. When you're purposely not even starting the engine because of shame or whatever, that is highly counterproductive for you. Now let's talk about the person who is networking and is able to clearly articulate what they're looking for and why they're looking for it. And now, Andy, into the values, and I'm looking for a role that's going to allow me to do X, Y, Z. I'm looking for a company who believes and demonstrates that they believe these kinds of things. Then, and some of the companies I've identified that I believe, would fit that mold are X, Y, and Z. Oh my gosh, it's like step change increase in the effectiveness, not the efficiency, the effectiveness of your networking, because you're actually, one, showing some self-awareness. Two is you're able to actually articulate it. And then three is it enables the person that you're speaking with to help you more, because you're telling them, hey, I'm looking to see if you know how to get from here to there. And if you don't know where there is, I guarantee you they don't know the way there. So yeah, I think this is really interesting how some of the comments and what you're talking about values, this is very integrated.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, right? I think if you're in an interview and you're clear on what your values are, right? It's kind of like raising a flag in the sense to see, or both saluting. I don't know, might not be the best metaphor, but it's what came to mind right now. And so I think the idea, if there's a fit, right, is to be much more clear. And if I'm interviewing someone and someone's articulating their values, they know what's most important to them, and it aligns with what we care about as a company. I mean, that's like oh yeah, right. This is, yes. So I think it increases, as you said, the effectiveness and the efficiency of the entire process. And you feel like you have a strategy, right? I think part of having a really secure sense of identity is there's a self-strategy, right? You understand who you are, and so you apply measures, you apply strengths, right? You're moving forward in a way that reinforces who you are.
I want to, obviously I'm a huge believer in getting professional support in these kinds of things. But I want to be sensitive to people that just might be feeling a lot of financial pressure or aren't all the way ready to, book an appointment with somebody. What are some tools or approaches someone might take to help them start to distill through their values and get more clarity on that?
Yeah, there are certainly free values assessments that you can find online. I wish I had a specific link to be able to send. We've got an assessment. Certainly, if someone really is in a place where they need something like that, happy to share that with someone. But I think being able to find some place. There's different values assessment measurements out there, right? I know there's ones where you take a test and then it sends you, here's your results based off your responses. Personally, having done this for 15 years now, my favorite values tests are when you sometimes just have a list of values-based words and you have to kind of struggle, right? It's a little more frustrating because trying to pick through, is this really what I care about, or is this just what I think I'm supposed to care about? And the whole right kind of it was a frustrating experience for me the first time going through and trying to define my values, right? I contemplated between different things, trying to find the perfect words for quite a while. But when you're able to find words that really are very specific and meaningful to you, it's much different than when a test comes back and maybe uses a word that might actually be accurate, but you don't resonate, right? That word doesn't really fit. And so you kind of reject sometimes the findings of that. So I think there's just something about needing to be able to identify, what are those words, and then really to know what they mean to you and why are they important. It's like they're really developing deep roots or anchor to who you are, right? And what motivates you and what brings you the greatest fulfillment. So I would highly encourage that. There's some great free resources that you can find. Once you are able to define whatever those, ideally try and keep it to about 5 values. I've had people who come, they're like, oh, I've done values work. And then they showed me a list of like 25 values. That really is impractical, right? Because you're needing to pull these up in real time when you're going through difficult moments, when you're having to prioritize, and making decisions, how you respond to things. And when you've got 25 values, it's just overwhelming, right? It's too much to pull from. But when you've got 5 or 3 or 6 or whatever that is, it's much more practical to be able to use that. That it really influences how you respond to difficult moments, how you celebrate, and everything. So, and once you've defined ideally about 5 core values, if you can write down what they mean to you, so define them, and write down why they're important, that's the gold, right? And then if you can then say, well, how do I want this to show up in my day-to-day life? And there's literally a 10-minute journaling exercise where that's just all you do. This is what this value means to me. This is why it's important. And this is how I want this to show up whenever I'm going through right now. It might be the most powerful psychological intervention that's ever been studied. I know that's a bold claim, but it actually isn't coming from me. It's coming from Dr. Kelly McGonigal at Stanford in one of her great books. and the list of benefits that you get from doing this exercise is really astounding, right? You feel more, your job performance goes up, you feel stronger, more capable, you spend less time ruminating, which I mean, that alone had me, right? Less time ruminating is enough for me to do the exercise. So
if we thought about just this is unfair to you, but like a quote prototypical, kind of a client who's got her 3 to 5 values, whatever those might be, right? And they're all individualized. There's not a right and a wrong. There's yours. How do you practically take that into a job search? How do whether it's identifying the kind of role? So again, just think of like kind of a typical client or just somebody in particular. How do I take that into figuring out what I want to do next? One, and then two is how do I figure out if there's really alignment from the company side?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that can be a little tricky. Obviously you can do a little research, right? Look at the company. Do they have their values posted? But we know lots of companies that have values posted. But that's the difference between a company and maybe the reputation that they want to get out and a company's identity, right? Your identity is who you really are. It's like what you actually practice and believe in. And so that sometimes can require, if there's a way to be able to have a conversation with someone, that works there. I know there's websites, is it Glassdoor? I think there's one, right, where you can sometimes see reviews. I don't know. Yeah. I haven't gone on there much to read, so I don't know if it's mostly people that have left the company or are now leaving angry reviews or not. But you want to get a sense of what they actually practice, right? What is the sense of how they treat their employees? So I think that's really important. And I think being able to, again, to articulate your values to whoever's interviewing you and in that process, I think even sometimes watching how they respond to that and being able to have a conversation of asking them, how is it that you practice your values, right? I think it's a great question. What are some of the ways in which you're intentional about applying these? It kind of flips the script a little bit too. I think a lot of times in an interview, it's like we feel like we're put on the spot. We've got to perform. We're trying to earn their approval. I think when you go in there with the sense of, well, I know what's important to me and I know my worth, it kind of puts you in a position where it's like, well, is this a good fit for me, right? And because it's a two-way thing. Like, this shouldn't just be I'm trying to get approval for a job. It might be a terrible fit for me. Instead, you're going into it with a sense of selection criteria, right? And it helps you to be much more empowered in how you approach that.
Larry Rosen, thanks for the call out on Fishbowl as well as another source to go get company feedback. I know that like integrity would be like a really, I think, common one that I hear. Integrity is really important to me. My belief is that that's an easy one to claim. It's a harder one to prove. And the only time that integrity really comes to the fore is when there's a situation, right? And now I have to make a choice based on my value. And so, I do another podcast called Cool Companies You Should Know. And we talk with founders or the leaders of the company about, what's the company culture like? What are the values that you guys would espouse? And, very often I will then ask them, well, can you give me an example
Love that.
of when, you guys, really your integrity was called into question and how you guys actually lived out that value. I remember we had one and it was something along the lines of prioritizing relationships over profitability. I'm like, that's really interesting. Like, can you give me an example of when you guys did that? And eventually kind of pulled a little bit of a rabbit out of a hat. But again, these are easy things to have posters on the wall about and to put in, statements about XYZ on the website or wherever. But, just really kind of directly asking, you guys talk a lot about respect. In your career here, where have you seen respect really, be extended to you, particularly if you were holding an unpopular view or doing something that may not have been in the main, yet you were treated with respect? Oh, right. So, I mean, you really can ask about these things, and these don't just have to be theoretical notions that, are hard to get at. But it does take a little bit of chutzpah to, hey, I want to ask you, not like where's everybody go for lunch or how many vacation days do I get?
Yeah.
But you guys claim this. Can you talk to me more about how that really works in the real world?
I love what you're saying there. And I think a company that you can tell is really authentic, right? In espousing or living out their values, you really should see radical consistency, right? There should be a sense that all their decisions are filtered through the lens of their values. I love using the Navy SEALs sometimes as an example, that they're so clear, right? That trust and this idea of teamwork is what they value. And so it really dominates their entire kind of process. So who they're choosing as potential soldiers to join the SEALs, right? They're looking for ones that have character strengths, integrity, loyalty, right? Great teamwork and things like that. So that they know exactly what candidate is a good fit. Then in their training process, they're reinforcing this notion of teamwork and trust, right? And they make sure to reward the teams that are high in that and their course correcting ones. So, and you see the stories that they tell, right, really reinforce this whole notion of brotherhood and, going through in this incredible trust and their whole motto of no man left behind. It's almost like this radical, kind of commitment. And, so they know exactly what they're looking for. It's this incredible consistency, and it helps people to self-select into it. And people want to rise up to the level of the culture, right? So they actually, reach their full potential. They know what's expected of them. So I know that's a pretty extreme example, right, of a organization that has a very clear sense of culture that seems to have radical consistency with it. But you should see the stories they tell, how they hire people, their training, that there's this consistent theme that runs through it. If you find a company that can clearly articulate that, like that's certainly a very good indicator.
Okay, so I want to be mindful of the time. Is there maybe just sort of like if you wanted to synopsize, basically what you would share with somebody on a 1-minute elevator ride up who's just been laid off, what would you say to them?
You got to be very careful around the stories, the meaning that you assign to what you're going through, right? It's going to be very tempting to get into the meaning of I was wronged. But the more that you can start to look at what action can you take to learn and grow from this, that's going to be absolutely essential. If you can keep coming back to, I know it's a term most people probably don't use in every day, but the inner locus of control. And then from there, define your values and make sure that those are guiding you through this entire process, the decisions you're making, what job that you choose. You'll find incredible strength and clarity by defining those values. I know the other two parts of the rowing thing I didn't quite get to, but it's about, knowing what you're intrinsically motivated by. Robert Greene, who's written amazing books around power, mastery, all these things. So the people that are most successful, usually they're excited about the choices they make. There's a sense that their work, their life, there's an excitement for it. And yet we often choose jobs or we choose things that are a poor fit, right? It's like we're not motivated. We feel like we're the hamster on the wheel. And then we have to work through all this resistance just to try and be motivated to do things. So, and then knowing what our strengths are and having an actual strategy for how to apply them to get the greatest leverage out of them. You put those three things together, and I think the likelihood that you get through this and not just, again, get through, but that you grow through it and you find a really great, way to pivot, that you come out of it in a much better place is extremely high.
Yep. And so that's fantastic. Andy, I've got a ton of respect for what you do. And if for no other reason, because I've seen the impact that you've had on shared clients' lives and that they really do come out of this much stronger, healthier, and thriving. So if people want to learn more about your practice, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, go to my website, ag-thrive.com. Yeah, there we go.
There you go. Awesome.
And thanks. I can say, one of my criteria, right, and whoever it is that I potentially collaborate with, is really character. Character matters more than anything else. Bob has that. He's a unicorn in that sense that he is both extremely intelligent, gifted, but he really cares, right? Like the sense of the people you work with, your character is fantastic. So just wanted to return that. It's been a great privilege to have done a little bit of work with you.
Well, thank you. I think that's why we get on Wells, because we do have shared values and a shared why. So that's cool. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Please feel free to share this episode with somebody else. This will be available as a podcast probably a little bit later on this afternoon. And then you can share that with people who might be going through a layoff or some other interruption in their work life. If you think this would be helpful, please feel free. That's why we're doing this, is to provide resources to people with no commercialization. Just want to make sure that people get the help that they need. So Andy, a pleasure as always. You're a great friend, great colleague. Thank you. And thank you again, everybody, for listening. We've got some great episodes coming up in September. I think our next one is with the CPG guys. So make sure you register for that. And with that, hope everyone has a wonderful Labor Day weekend. And thank you again for listening.